Before saying anything about what this video is about, I want to say a few things concerning what this video is not about. It isn't a video about the law. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not saying that former President Donald Trump is guilty of any crime. That's up to a jury to decide. Nor is this a claim that Trump did anything wrong. As for what Trump did or did not do, I'll leave that up to the jury to discover as well. Instead, what I'll be speaking about here is if somebody were to have done what Trump is accused to have done in the indictment filed against him in Washington, D.C., then that person would have done something immoral, according to the standards of morality that I defend in this channel. So let me prove that. In order to make a moral assessment about what Trump and his alleged co-conspirators allegedly did, we're going to have to ask what Trump and his alleged co-conspirators allegedly did. The actions that I'm going to focus on here are these. Allegedly, Trump and his co-conspirators sought to have people in 7 target states cast a total of 84 fraudulent electoral votes for Donald Trump, depriving Biden of an equal number of votes and giving Trump the election. The states that were targeted were these: Arizona with 11 electoral votes, Georgia with 16 electoral votes, Michigan with 16 electoral votes, Nevada with 6 electoral votes, New Mexico has 5 electoral votes, Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes, and Wisconsin has 10 electoral votes. For each of these states, the state officials sent in accordance with state law, electoral votes for Joseph Biden. The plan was to find a group of people in each state who would, quote, mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow under the Constitution and other federal and state laws, end quote. Then transmit these fraudulent votes to Washington, D.C., and have these fraudulent votes for Trump replace the legitimate votes for Biden. So the moral question is, would these acts count as morally wrong? As a reminder, the principle of wrongness that I defend on this channel holds that an act is wrong if people generally have many and strong reasons to give people reasons not to perform acts of that type. My paradigm example is drunk driving. Drunk driving is wrong because you, me, and virtually everybody has reasons, namely reasons based on the fact that we don't want to be killed or maimed by drunk drivers or have those we care about killed or maimed by drunk drivers. We have reasons to give everybody reasons not to drive while drunk. These reasons may be external in the forms of legal and social penalties, or they may be internal, raising people to have a sense of guilt or shame or a simple aversion to doing such a thing that, in all but extreme cases, would motivate an agent to take steps to avoid driving while drunk. I would argue that it's morally wrong to create fraudulent votes and to seek to have them replace legitimate votes in an election, which is one of the things that Trump and his alleged co-conspirators are accused of doing. This seems too obvious to require a defense. However, I'm going to defend it because a lot of people seem not to understand the moral case against Trump, and because it provides an illustrative example for the moral theory that I defend here. One thing that I want to note, because of false claims circulating around the public that's meant to confuse the issue, is that this is not a free speech issue. What we have here are 84 fraudulent votes that were cast. We can imagine somebody walking into a voting booth, pretending to be an eligible voter, filling out a ballot, casting a vote, coming before a judge and saying, "Your Honor, I was just exercising my First Amendment rights to freedom of speech." Such a defense simply isn't applicable here. The actual case, or the part of the case that I'm interested in here, has to do with these 84 fraudulent votes that were sent in, and to ask the question of whether anybody did anything morally wrong in arranging for these 84 fraudulent votes to be cast and transmitted as if they were legitimate votes for the purpose of using them to change the results of the election. And to get an idea what the issue is, note that there are a total of 538 votes cast in the Electoral College. 84 votes out of 538 would be like discovering in a state like Florida, assuming 5,380,000 total votes, discovering that some organization had tried to switch 840,000 votes lawfully cast for one candidate over to the other candidate in order to give the other candidate the win in the election. If somebody were to have tried to do this, would they have been doing something wrong? The theory that I defend says that an act is wrong if people generally have reasons to give people reasons not to perform acts of that type. So, do people have reasons to give people reasons not to arrange to have fraudulent votes cast and use those fraudulent votes to change the results of the election? Imagine that the year is 2024. Imagine that the incumbent, Joe Biden, and his vice president, Kamala Harris, lose the election, acquiring 232 electoral votes to their opponent's 306. Do people have reasons to give Biden reasons not to arrange to have 84 fraudulent electoral votes cast and used to replace 84 legitimate votes for Biden's opponent? It would seem to me that they do. One might object that only Biden's opponents have reasons to provide Biden with reasons not to do this, but Biden supporters would have no such reason. However, recall that the moral question has to do with whether people generally have reasons to give people reasons not to perform acts of a particular type. When talking about the wrongness of drunk driving, we're asking about whether people generally have reasons to give people reasons not to drive while drunk, not what they might say about some specific case or other. So in the case of voting, we're asking whether people generally have reasons to give people reasons not to conspire to have fraudulent votes cast and used to overturn elections, not about any specific case in which this might be done. For another application, consider the 2000 election where the election depended on who won the very close race in Florida. Al Gore, one of the candidates running for office, was vice president at the time. Should Al Gore have been permitted to arrange for Florida Democrats to send in a fraudulent set of electoral college votes that he could then use to declare himself the winner of that election? We can see here the absurdity of identifying the types of actions listed in Trump's indictment as permissible. It would completely undermine the ability of the voters to select the next president. The selection of the next president would instead be given to the sitting vice president, who would either select themselves or would select somebody who would allow the vice president the most profit from their position as kingmaker. Now, if the truth were told, some viewers long before this point would have asked, why are you talking about this issue as if it's a legitimate moral issue? Of course it's wrong to cast fraudulent votes and to try to use them to replace legitimate votes. That's too obvious to even discuss. And I agree, it seems obvious to me too. However, I also see a lot of people who don't seem to understand what is at stake. And there are a lot of people who are strongly committed to the idea that Trump, if he were a part of such a conspiracy, did nothing wrong. Consequently, I wanted to create a video that just put what was obvious front and center. That what we're talking about here is an alleged conspiracy to send in fraudulent votes and try to use them to replace legitimate votes. And that people generally, everybody of both major political parties and of no party and of any third party, have reasons to consider the act type of casting fraudulent votes and using them to try to replace legitimate votes is wrong. Okay, then, the next step in this explication is to ask, what does it mean to say that the act type of creating fraudulent electoral votes and using them to select the next president of the United States is wrong? One of the things it means, its most serious and substantive implication, is that people generally have reasons to give people reasons not to perform actions of that type. Drunk driving is wrong implies that people generally have reasons to give everybody reasons not to drive while drunk. The wrongness of casting fraudulent votes and trying to use them to change the results of an election implies that people generally have reasons to give everybody reasons not to perform acts of this type. Among the reasons that people have to give other people to not do acts of this type are external reasons. External reasons include criminal penalties. We give President Biden and Vice President Harris reasons not to create fraudulent electoral votes and try to use them to stay in power by making it clear to them that any attempt to do so risks a prison sentence. One of the best ways to make this clear to them is by showing them that those who have tried this, if they're convicted of doing so, suffer consequences that the sitting president and vice president would want to avoid. People also have reasons to give other people internal reasons not to perform actions of a particular type. Internal reasons have to do with one's character, the type of person one is. Is this candidate somebody with enough integrity that they'll not try to arrange to replace legitimate votes with fraudulent votes so that they can stay in power? Is this the type of person willing to respect the will of the people and the rule of law? One way to make sure that a sitting president doesn't use fraudulent votes to stay in office is to make sure that people prone to engage in this kind of behavior don't get elected. If we fail to give people external and internal reasons not to use fraudulent votes to stay in power, then we can expect people to be using fraudulent votes to stay in power. So yes, the issue really isn't all that complicated. The act of casting fraudulent electoral votes and attempting to use them to overturn an election is in fact immoral. People generally have reasons to give people reasons not to perform acts of this type. This includes external reasons, making sure that criminal penalties are imposed on any who would try such a thing, and internal reasons, making sure that those who would endorse the use of such tactics are kept away from government power and giving power instead to people whose character is such that they simply couldn't consider using fraudulent votes to win an election. And this brings up one last point. Trump is calling the prosecution of this case against him election interference. It's not. It's of vital interest that the people know whether the person they are electing into office is the type of person who will use fraudulent votes to stay in power. This needs to be known before votes are cast, not after.